Welcome back to the table. What I wanted to do today was give you an update on where I'm at with learning Tokyo Express and play a few sample turns, kind of give you an idea of what I have learned and maybe give you an idea as to how the game plays. Now, what I have here is an ongoing battle kind of in this upper northeast section of the map. What we have is two formations of Japanese. I'm just going to bring the camera in on the action here, which consists of a destroyer that I'm trying to read these upside down, but the Teruzaki. Now, some of these ships, they don't print the entire name on the counter, so I'm trying to do my best to remember what ship we're looking at on the name and try to get it right. But it should be for destroyers. I'm looking in the T section. Yeah, it says here Teruzuki, but there should be an I or an A or something after that, because Japanese doesn't end in just like a hard K, but it's not on the sheet. Like Shimakaze, they just have Shimkaz, or maybe it's Shimkaze. I don't know. Some of these I think are missing some vowels on the end. But Teruzuki, according to them. Then we have a light cruiser Tenru and a light cruiser Yubari. That's a formation. And trying to remember the rules, the way that the Japanese set up their formations were different than the Americans. The Japanese, paraphrasing the designer notes in my poor memory, they grouped their ships together differently, kind of to like purpose built. And it says that light cruisers need to form up with destroyers when they can, or destroyers all by themselves. If there's no destroyers, then light cruisers could go with heavy cruisers, but heavy cruisers and battleships. So essentially the Japanese have light task forces and like heavy task forces, whereas the Americans, they can set up whatever they want. And interesting design notes were saying that gave the Japanese some flexibility in terms of when they have their doctrine, whose job is to do what. Well, light task forces know what to do, heavy task. So anyway, we've got a formation there of two light cruisers and a destroyer, then a heavy formation of the Furutaka and the Kinugasa. Again, there's no vowel at the end, so I don't know if that's a Kinugasa or a Kinugase or something like that. I don't know Japanese ships from World War II history well enough to tell you what it should be, but I do believe the Furutaka is a heavy cruiser, because I think that's in World War ships. If it's in World War ships, I might know the name. Now, for the Americans, we've already lost a destroyer. It is sinking. So we got the Cushing, which already took some damage. My Admiral Callahan is on the heavy cruiser Northampton. And then in here is the Chicago, another heavy cruiser, and then the Salt Lake City is my other heavy cruiser, and then bringing up the back is the destroyer Drayton. And that's just one task force. I did that for simplicity because there's rules where if you have different task forces, the admiral on the flagship, his task force will follow out the orders you give it exactly, whereas other task forces, based on their distance to the admiral's flagship, make a roll. Otherwise, there's like a U.S. freedom of action, meaning the admiral in charge of a different task force might decide that they do something different. And it's very interesting, some of those rules, to really help give you that sense of confusion in the night conflicts. Again, paraphrasing the designer notes, love designer notes, is that the Japanese had doctrine that they would follow, and so in the absence of communication with a higher up, they could follow the doctrine and they knew their job to do, oversimplifying it. The Americans, on the other hand, they didn't have quite the doctrine in place that the Japanese had for like night operations, for example, and so in the absence of communication with command, sometimes an admiral of their task force might do something on their own that they thought was the best course of action. Again, oversimplifying it. Some people might say that that's good, that gives a lot of flexibility to the Americans, but I think that from what the design notes were trying to get across was that could actually be very hurtful, because if there was an overall plan of your flagship and you have another commander somewhere off to the side doing their own thing, then your plans have fallen apart. Whereas a doctrine that the Japanese had would allow the plan to stay somewhat intact, even though communication might be lost due to interference, the sound of battle, preventing it from the instructions being heard correctly. Movies have some examples. Charge of the Light Brigade talks about confusion of orders coming down. I think if you watch Greyhound, there's like Tom Hanks is trying to shout orders out and it's hard to hear. So anyhow, it's neat to see a little basic mechanic in there to help instill that sense of confusion into the game. The other thing too that I like is, and I just thought of it and I just lost it, but it'll come back to me later. The nighttime fighting. The detection range of the Japanese is out to 10 hexes for visual detection, and then the visual detection for the Americans is 7. So again, kind of maybe simplifying the design notes, I thought it was cool that, and I didn't know this, the Japanese were specifically trained for night operations, and the Americans weren't the same. And possibly the Americans were taught more to rely on the technology of their radars and stuff, which I'm understanding in the earlier part of the war wasn't as good as good old-fashioned human eyeballs that the Japanese trained to. Later in the war that changed, but in the early part of the war, that did give the Japanese an advantage to nighttime gunnery, for example, detection and whatnot. So that's another cool thing to see. This particular game that we have right now, you'll see the forces are close, so that range isn't an issue. When the game first starts out, there is a bit of a distance between the two the 3 task forces total, and that did actually allow the Japanese to start gunnery fire on the Americans when the Americans had no idea what was going on. All right, so those are just some things I've learned in playing. I thought cool, and I like how the rules try to kind of bring that into the game. Now, what we have specifically here is the Japanese are now traveling in a south direction, and they're passing the Americans who are now traveling north. This is actually, I would say, fully into turn 2, and this had just finished phase 3. The Japanese, let's see if I can move this without giving you too much whiplash. Japanese, the Kinugasa has taken 3 damage from gunfire, has lost 1 speed. They're at the first damage box. That 1 is essentially like a loss of speed, and when they do gunnery, they get a downshift on the gunnery table. So this just kind of represents some damage to the ship. And I thought, this was okay. In the design notes, they brought out a good point. Some games will actually have you track specifically what cannon is taking damage or what turret or whatever. Here they kind of explained it where it isn't maybe necessarily that a specific weapon system was hit, but inside the ship there's a lot of pipes, conduits, wiring, plumbing, and if you hit one of the subsystems that maybe supplies, and this is me making stuff up, but like if it supplies electrical power to the turret, or if they're pneumatically operated at all, you're hitting some of the support machinery of the turret. So the turret itself may not have been hit at all, a person could argue, but the supporting equipment inside the ship to let that gunnery work effectively has been affected. So they don't actually have to track specifically what weapon system was hit. And, when you explain it to me that way, well, then I'm okay with that. It also affects speed because, again, you're hitting the machinery inside the ship. So the Kinugasa has also fired both its set of torpedoes. Oh, man, that's something else, too. I knew that the American ships don't, like the American, I think there's like 1 American heavy cruiser and 1 American light cruiser or allied cruiser that they have on the sheets we'll look at that have torpedoes. None of these ships up here for the Americans carry torpedoes, and they are devastating. So the Japanese have a huge advantage with their torpedoes. Then the Furutaka has also suffered some gunnery damage and has fired off both its torpedoes. And then the light cruiser Tenryu has also fired off its centerline torpedoes, no damage. And the Yubari has also fired off its torpedo and no damage on it. And I don't think, oh, did I put Tenryu Yubari? Yeah, the Tenryuzaka, trying to find it on my sheet here. Okay, the Teruzaka maybe has fired off its torpedoes. So that's at least one thing going in the Americans' favor, is the torpedoes are gone for the Japanese. However, in that, the Americans have suffered a little bit. The Chicago has taken some damage. Now, it doesn't really matter necessarily if the damage came from torpedoes or gunnery. In determining some effects, it does. But in general, once I start marking off boxes, I don't remember where it came from. I think the Northampton took a torpedo hit and some gunnery damage, but the Chicago has taken 3 points of damage. It also has lost a point off of gunnery and speed. The Northampton is close to sinking, and that's bad because that's where the American Admiral is. But it's suffered quite a bit of damage, and it's down 2 speed and 2 on the gunnery chart. Then the Cushing, that's sunk. That ate a torpedo and some gunnery. It's gone. And then the Drayton on the back side, no damage, but it's fired off its port side torpedoes. But it still has its center torpedo and starboard torpedo. So it's got a little bit. That's the main focal point of the torpedo firepower for the Americans, is the destroyers, which aren't nearly as good as the Japanese torpedoes. So before we dive into the game, just another observation about torpedoes. I think that's very interesting that the Japanese had the foresight and took the time to really develop their naval warfare. I guess they figured since they're an island nation, they need to have a souped up navy, and torpedoes, I think, really gave them that advantage. Their torpedoes shoot further. They carry more salvos of torpedoes on their ships, and apparently they were way more reliable than the Americans. So they definitely invested in torpedoes. Now, for the basic game, you do not worry about the reloads for torpedoes, which some of these ships have reloads. So in the basic game that we're playing, once you fire those torpedoes, there's no reload. So thankfully for the Americans, I think the Japanese have used all their torpedoes in the opening rounds. Well, the Tenryu still has one more volley. However, it doesn't say. I guess it's a center line as well. So it carries several torpedoes probably on the middle area on a rotating dispenser. So I think the Tenryu has some torpedoes, but everybody else is pretty much done. Alright, so that was my last observation that I wanted to share. Let's get into the game. Hopefully that means going forward, less talk from me and more looking at the game. So this is, like I said, turn 2. We just finished phase 3. So up to this point, the Japanese were actually coming parallel, and so both the Americans and Japanese did exchange some broadside of gunnery. And then on the phase 3, the Japanese completed their 180-degree order turn. The Americans still have a 60-degree port turn to run. However, since the Japanese are right here, I really didn't want to turn port into. I was hoping the Japanese would come a little more further south, and then I could execute a port turn around them. But if the Japanese don't turn more favorably here in a little bit, I think I'll have to reread the rules on stacking ships into the same hex. You can, but I was really hoping to avoid that. So in the sequence of play, which I have off here to the side, so I'll just kind of call things off as we go. Essentially, I'm right at the beginning of the second Japanese movement orders phase. So the Japanese get to choose or change orders twice in a turn. The Americans make their decision at the beginning of the turn, and then they're stuck with that. So I've been rocking this 60-degree port turn for 3 phases now, waiting on when I would turn it. If I don't turn soon, I'll have to do it in the last phase. Now, to just a small tutorial to determine the Japanese order. There is, and I'll probably refer to this less and less as we go, at least on camera. But essentially what we do is you take the closest ships, which, and they're kind of equal distance, but we'll say, since this is the lead ship of the American task force, and here's the closest, I mean, since that's the lead ships of the Japanese task force, but they do have some rules in there about picking the closest ships to each other, is to determine reference points. So we'll say that this destroyer is the reference point. So this chart shows the silhouette of a ship with the 4 directions. So this will be the American reference ship and the direction it's traveling. And then since our Japanese reference ships are right here, kind of in the, just off to the left, they would be in this area of hexes next to the reference ship. So this little chart gives a little, it's your AI to determine where things are going. And it gives us some information. What we're going to do though is start by rolling a die 10. I lost my die 10 on the floor. I had to pick it up. Okay, so I roll a die 10. Don't ask me how I got there. So I roll a 3. Now this is color coded by the heavy task force or the light task force. So we'll do the heavy task force, that's red if I remember right. Blue is heavy ships. So I rolled a 3. So here it says a 3. The ships are going to face this direction. So the Japanese ships move a little differently than the Americans. That what happens is this chart tells you what the ship's newest facing is. And then you rotate all of them. So you rotate the reference ship, and then all the ships in that task force will face that new direction. Then you look here and it says the new order is a 60 degree to the port. And I have a 60 degree port. So I'm going to put that here. So boom. They now have a 60 degree port. So that means over the next 3 phases, I roll a dice, and then if I roll a 1 through 4 on like phase 4 and 5, it'll turn. So I'll show you that in a second because I think I over-explained it. But basically, I'll roll to see if they execute that order. If they don't execute it by phase 6, they automatically execute it. All right, then I'm going to roll for the light ships. Now, I was thinking about why do they seem to be so maneuverable? They can turn 2 hex sides, 3 hex sides. It's just because this really does help the AI in determining how it's going to drive and steer in relation to the opponent's ship. And in the absence of a human player, the game needs some system to make somewhat realistic maneuvers. And so this is how it does it. So they're going to start off by changing their facing. So it does make them seem a lot more maneuverable than the Americans, but really it's just a way to help the AI make good decisions. Okay, then I'm going to roll for the light, and that's red, and that's a 9. So 9 tells me that they are going to now face north. So they turn a couple hex sides as well. I was trying to play this without tweezers, but my fat fingers get in the way, and even though it might be easier, oh, I got those facing the wrong way. You also got to be careful of facing, because the side that lists the port and starboard directions, that's the front of the ship. So these 2 task forces have split, and then there's going to be another 60 degree port. Oh no, it just says ahead. Never mind. So now this light cruiser group is going to speed ahead. They're going to maintain speed 6. So they're going ahead. So I don't need to put down a marker for that. Okay, good. All right. So the Japanese AI has plotted their movement for the upcoming phases. Perfect. And that's kind of how we'll play out the last bit of this turn, only because combat has already occurred. Right here in the basic game, what happens is you have a cup. I have a little chit bag, but you put in 5 chits, and then you put in one that says combat. And since there's 6 phases, that means one of these phases in a turn is going to generate a combat opportunity. And when you draw a chit, and if it's blank, you just leave it out of the bag, and then the next time you have to draw a chit. That just simply increases the chance of combat. Now, that might seem like a hokey mechanic, and I thought about that too, because if these fleets are so close to each other, why would they not continue to shoot at each other? Well, I got to thinking about that, and I think I have remembered reading that there are instances at night, and depending on how dark it is, they could actually sail pretty close to each other in terms of ships and not know the other person was there. Like, they practice really strict light discipline and noise discipline. That's why, you know, from what I read, searchlights only came on in like what they would consider an absolute emergency. So it was dark, dark, dark. Because you turn on one searchlight, boom, that's a target. So that's why combat, I think, only really happens once per turn. So we're just going to finish out this turn showing you some movement. Okay, now, once we get to the end of the turn and we talk about the terminal stage, we'll update some information here that we have. But for the moment, now that the Japanese second movement order phase is done, we then go to the 4th movement phase, which is the U.S. movement segment. Alright, so I have a little chart. It runs by phases. So based on your speed and then what phase you're in, it tells you how many hexes you move. Since I'm on the 4th movement phase, basically anybody that had a speed greater than 1 gets to move 1 hex. This is a real familiar chart if you've ever played a game like Starfleet Battles. Your speed is broken down over the 6 phases of a turn. That's how much you move. With Starfleet Battle, just a side note, man, I just remember that had like 32 impulses, and if you had a 32, you were moving 32 hexes or inches if you played miniatures. So this is kind of a similar system to that. Alright, so it is the 4th movement phase. All my ships move 1 hex. Even the sinking ship, it still moves. So all these folks move that direction. And I do not want to execute my 60-degree port turn yet. I want to see what happens here, because the Japanese, they're going to execute a maneuver. The light group is just moving straight ahead. That's interesting. Okay, we'll start with them, because after the U.S. movement phase is Japanese movement segment. So the Japanese will move, and that light group has moved. And the heavy cruiser group moves. And now we roll to see if they execute the maneuver. On a roll of 4, they do. A roll of 5. So they will not execute their turn yet. And then we would do the action chit draw. However, at this point, because combat has already occurred for the turn, I'm not going to draw the action chit because that's already happened. So that means next time we play on turn 2, you're going to get to see some combat at some point. Okay, so then we go to the 5th movement phase, so U.S. movement segment. That destroyer is still sinking, but it moves. And all of that moves. They move. And, you know, actually I think what we'll do, since I see a split, I see the split, my little people on the ground might not. We'll go ahead and let me check real quick if I do that turn now. I'll be right back. Okay, I just wanted to be sure. You can execute the turn before or after you move, and I think that's what I'm going to do, is actually execute the turn now. Since I know the Japanese light squad will be going on ahead, we're going to see if maybe we can line up at some point once they've moved. So if I do get to attack next turn, I can hit them, and they would be limited in their return fire. So we're going to, and it's for the whole formation. So if once you execute, all those ships turn. and they'll go to port. Oh, I got my ships backwards. Hold on. I don't know if you can see that without zooming in too much. There's a little indicators here for port or starboard, and I'm trying to make sure to remember to keep these facing properly, because I think I've been driving my ships backwards. I just noticed that I've been driving my ships backwards. Yeah, don't laugh. Oops. Alright, so they turn port 1. Yeah, if it's just one ship, that's easier. We'll just turn 1. Where was he? Here and here. Okay, and put the Callahan back onto the Northampton. Alright, and that port order is off the board. So they have executed their order for this entire turn. Then the Japanese get a movement, so we'll move them because they were moving ahead, so they move 1 and they move 1. So that cleared up some space, so we can, hopefully in the next turn be able to broadside them, and they'll be limited in their return fire to just like their rear facing primary weaponry. And then the heavy group is now separated out, and they're going to roll to see if they execute. They rolled a 2, so they will now execute their turn. And I'd have to go back and check. I think they move and then roll. I'd have to look real quick because I don't know if the Japanese need to roll before they turn. I'll just check. I'll be right back. Okay, it does say at the end of the movement phase you roll to see if they execute the order. So I moved them, re-rolled. They will now execute the order, and they're turning to the port. You know what? And I got them driving backwards too. Yeah, I faced them the wrong way when they made their maneuver because they were heading that way. And now it says they execute their order to the port. Alright, so that's something I got to be very careful of in the future, is making sure I keep the front facing of the ships. Otherwise, yeah, it's going to look goofy. You have ships driving backwards, and they're not driving backwards. Just Eddie is not paying attention very well to his facings on those ships. Okay, so that would have been the end of the 5th Japanese movement segment. Again, I'm going to skip the action chit draw segment because the combat's already occurred. Now, yeah, as far as I know, it doesn't go back in because I think it said once the chit comes out. And I'll double check that because maybe I missed out on some opportunities here. Because again, my memory's not the best. Yeah, just referencing the rules, it mentions those chits don't go back in until the beginning chit management phase of the next turn. So in my mind, combat only occurs once a turn. So 5th movement segment is done. Then we go to the 6th movement phase. So US movement, since we're still all speed 6, we will advance 1 more hex on our journey of life. So we're trying to pull parallel with the Japanese now. And then it's the Japanese movement segment, so they'll move their light formation here. And Japanese move forward 1. Alright, that takes out of the broadside here. The broadside, they can broadside, they'll be out of broadside. Of course, the next turn, this could all be different because the Japanese would get new movement orders that might completely change how they're moving. Alright, well, I guess another way too, how you could justify what looks like a lot of turns on the Japanese part is the fact that it's at night and the Americans don't really know where the Japanese are. These are all approximations of where the Japanese ships are, and when you draw that combat chits, that's where someone yells, ship or whatever, and they actually see the Japanese where they are. So that's another cool mechanic they got in there that I just, depending on how you think about it, that's actually really neat. Alright, so let's get you a little bit closer. And of course, there's no action chits to draw because we're done with that. Then it says the terminal stage. Alright, so a couple things will happen here. One, sunk vessels are removed. And I thought that was interesting, but they give the vessel that's sinking, plenty of opportunity to travel, and it goes down here. So if you want to mark on your map where ships sink, this would be the opportunity. So it started sinking back here somewhere, but it finally sunk up here. So there you go. There's one for the Iron Bottom Sound, and its sinking marker comes off. It is sunk. Then, just looking here, counter adjustment. Okay. Now, as far as damage goes, this is where you would now apply speed penalties. So the Chicago lost a speed point. The Chicago was speed 6, so it's speed 5. So what I'll do is we'll go and I'll grab some of the markers for speed. I don't have them all punched. I'm trying very hard not to punch any markers unless I absolutely need it, because I'm trying to maintain the integrity of this classic game as much as possible. Hard to maintain integrity when you're tearing it apart, but I'm trying to use the minimal amount of counters as possible. So I'm going to pull out just the counters I need and then show you how we can apply that to the game. So give me a moment. Alright, so I've grabbed the speed markers, and what I see here, the Japanese player, he did take some damage to, I'm trying to remember, the Teruzuka or Teruzaka, I don't know. But anyway, it was a speed 7, but it did suffer 1 speed point, and the group was already going at speed 6 because at least the Tenru was a speed 6, and they go the fastest speed of the slowest ship, so they didn't lose anything there. The heavy cruiser section, though, the Furutaka, it did take a point of damage, so its speed is dropped to 5. So that formation goes at 5, so that's the reminder marker for that. And same here, which one was it? Chicago, one of the American cruisers is now going speed 5, so their formation will now be speed 5. And that's that as far as the damage assessment. So we sunk a ship. Now, gunnery damage is applied immediately. So, I mean, for example, the effects of gunnery damage. But sinking ships, changing speed, some of those things occur at the end of the turn. So ships in this game, it isn't necessary that the ship just immediately stopped. I guess you could say there's some inertia. The ship is in the process of slowing down. So you only really have to manage that once in the game turn. That's not too bad. It does include little damage reminder markers for that specifically, though. That way when you get to the end of the phase, you flip it and you're like, oh yeah, we took a point of damage or whatever. But again, just to maintain some integrity of the game pieces, I just have to remember that I marked down the damage on their sheet of paper, and then at the end of the turn here, manage the speeds and things appropriately based on damage that they've taken. So, but I am using the speed markers as a reminder. Okay, so after you do the damage effects phase, then there's a counter adjustment phase. That's where all the ships that participated in combat, gunnery, and whatnot, I gotta flip these over now, from the fired side, that's what the little, it looks like the ship is on fire burning, but that just simply means they've shot all of their weaponry. So I'm just flipping them. They flip on the short edge, so we maintain facing, and got to make sure I put Northampton back on top because that's where the Admiral is, and we're down 1 destroyer. Alright, flip, 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 and flip, 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 and there we go. And then it's any end of turn items. So end of turn phase, that would be check for victory conditions, turn marker, then you advance like the game turn marker and whatnot, and then begin the next turn. Alright, so that is your introduction to Tokyo Express. So what I am going to do though is not in this video, but we'll make a separate video just for an entire turn of play. That way you can see combat. Now, if you are if you know Tokyo Express, please leave some comments. Did you enjoy it? I'm enjoying this so far. I think this is turning out really good. But as I explain things, if you see that I make a mistake, as usual, please point it out. But otherwise, it's a solitary game and it's just me. So if I make a mistake and no one catches it, fun is the key. But yeah, if you do find a mistake, let me know. But that is the beginning journeys into Tokyo Express, and I'm actually thoroughly enjoying the experience. So I hope to see you all as we continue that journey together. All right, talk to you all later. Bye.